On May 14, 1985, the final red tractor rolled off a half-lit assembly line in Rock Island, Illinois. It was an International Harvester 5488. The paint was flawless. The diesel engine was primed. But there was no celebration. Thousands of workers, mechanics, and engineers stood in absolute silence as the rubber tires touched the concrete floor for the last time. The heavy steel doors of Farmall Works were closing forever. For more than half a century, this labyrinth of blast furnaces and assembly tracks had been the beating heart of the American harvest. It was a mythical kingdom of iron and fire. It birthed millions of machines, dictating the rhythm of rural life from the cornfields of Iowa to the vast wheat plains of the Dakotas. At its peak, the facility employed over 5,000 people, operating around the clock in a relentless, synchronized dance of molten metal and mechanical precision. It was the largest tractor manufacturing facility on the face of the earth. Its output was so staggering that it practically eliminated the draft horse from the American landscape. It seemed completely invincible, a towering fortress of Midwestern industrial ambition. Yet in the span of a few agonizing years, this titan was brought to its knees, hollowed out by forces it could not out-engineer. The real story of Farmall Works in America is not just the shuttering of a brick-and-mortar plant. It is a profound lesson in growth and loss, a story of an industrial empire that fundamentally reshaped the American soil, only to be crushed under the unbearable weight of corporate debt, labor strife, and a rural economy that simply stopped buying. Every week, we tell the stories of the machines that built the American harvest and the ruthless market forces that ultimately tore them down. Subscribe if that history matters to you. But long before the final steel doors closed in Rock Island, the story of this red empire began in an era when American horsepower still meant living, breathing horses. Before the red tractors dominated the American harvest, the landscape of rural production was bound by muscle, sweat, and hay. In the early 1920s, American agriculture was trapped in an exhausting paradox. The nation was industrializing rapidly. Factories in Detroit were turning out automobiles by the millions. Yet out in the vast fields of the Midwest, a farmer's limit was still dictated by the biological endurance of draft animals. Early gasoline tractors existed, but they were massive, crude, and heavy machines built almost exclusively for plowing or powering stationary threshing belts. They were essentially steel behemoths that compacted the soil and required a small crew to operate. For a wheat farmer in Montana, these giant tractors made sense. But for the vast majority of the American market, the farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana growing corn, soybeans, and cotton, those early tractors were practically useless. These farmers grew row crops, plants sown in precisely spaced lines. A farmer needed to cultivate these rows throughout the growing season to destroy weeds and aerate the soil. A massive steel-wheeled tractor would simply crush the growing plants. So even if a farmer bought a tractor for heavy spring plowing, he still had to keep, feed, and house a team of horses all year round just to do the delicate row crop work. Keeping horses required dedicating nearly a quarter of a farm's acreage just to grow feed for the animals. That was the land that produced no cash income. The American market did not need a bigger plowing engine. It needed a mechanical horse. In Chicago, Illinois, the engineers at International Harvester understood this gap in the market. IH was already an agricultural giant, born from the legacy of Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. They possessed the capital, the foundries, and the dealer network to change the industry, but they needed the right machine. In the early 1920s, an IH engineer named Bert Benjamin finalized a radical new design. It was a lightweight tractor with a narrow front end, two wheels spaced closely together, that could easily navigate between planted rows. It had high rear axle clearance, allowing the belly of the machine to pass safely over growing corn stalks. It was designed to pull a plow, power a belt, and, crucially, cultivate row crops. They called it the Farmall because it was designed to do all the work on a family farm. The first Farmall tractors, as known as the Regular, were introduced in 1924. They carried a retail price of roughly $825 in period dollars, approximately $14,600 today. For a Midwestern farmer, this was a massive capital investment, often requiring a loan against the upcoming harvest. But the economics were undeniable. A farmall could plow acres of land faster than a team of horses, and unlike horses, it did not consume fuel when it was resting in the barn. The response from the American market was overwhelming. International Harvester quickly realized that their existing production facilities could not keep pace with the orders flooding in from their Midwestern dealership network. They needed a dedicated, massive industrial fortress to build this new category of machine. In 1926, International Harvester acquired a sprawling, obsolete factory site in Rock Island, Illinois. Situated on the banks of the Mississippi River, the location offered perfect logistical access. Iron ore and coal could arrive by river barge or rail, and finished tractors could be shipped out directly to the heart of the Corn Belt. IH stripped the old buildings to their structural bones and poured millions of dollars into constructing a state-of-the-art assembly line. They christened the facility Farmall Works. When Farmall Works opened its doors in 1926, it was not merely a factory. It was a declaration of industrial intent. International Harvester was betting its future on the total mechanization of the American farm. The timing was perfect. Throughout the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the American farm economy was shifting. Despite the crushing weight of the Great Depression, the sheer efficiency of the Farmall tractor forced adoption. Farmers who refused to mechanize simply could not compete on yield or labor costs. By 1930, Farmall Works was turning out 200 tractors a day. The International Harvester Dealer Network, a sprawling web of local hardware stores, dedicated implement dealers, and regional distributors, pushed the red tractors into every county in the Midwest. A farmer in rural Indiana did not just buy a machine. He bought the assurance that the local IH dealer stocked the specific gears, belts, and carburetors required to keep that machine running through the brief, unforgiving window of the spring planting season. The agricultural press of the period, including trade publications like Implement and Tractor, recognized the shift. The arrival of the Farmall from Rock Island was rapidly accelerating the decline of the draft horse. Between 1920 and 1940, the American draft horse population plummeted, directly mirroring the rise in tractor production. Farmall Works was not just building equipment, it was actively rewiring the biological and economic foundation of American agriculture, one red chassis at a time. The era of muscle was ending. The era of the row crop empire had begun. By the late 1930s, the concept of the row crop tractor was economically proven, but the machines themselves were still visually and mechanically crude. International Harvester realized that to achieve absolute market dominance across the United States, they needed to standardize their empire. In 1939, in 1939, Farmall Works unleashed a mechanical revolution that would define the American agricultural landscape for the next half-century, the Farmall Letter Series. The two most consequential models to roll off the Rock Island assembly line were the Farmall H and the heavier, more powerful Farmall M. When an American farmer walked onto a rural implement lot in the summer of 1939, the machine sitting under the sun looked unlike anything previously built. Designed with the input of legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy, the Farmall H possessed a sleek, streamlined hood that narrowed toward the front grille. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a precise engineering solution to maximize operator visibility. Looking down from the high steel seat, The farmer had a clear, unobstructed view of the front tires and the delicate, growing crop below. The entire machine was bathed in a vibrant new color, officially designated as IH Red, a shade chosen specifically to increase visibility and safety on rural American dirt roads. It sat high above the ground on massive rear rubber tires with a narrow tricycle-style front axle. This allowed the tractor to turn tightly at the end of a planted row without crushing a single stalk of corn. But the true breakthrough of the letter series was not its styling. It was the integration of controllable power. The Farmall H was equipped with a standardized PTO, or power takeoff, a rotating shaft at the rear of the transmission that transfers engine power directly from the tractor to an implement, such as a towed baler or a mechanical corn picker. Before the standardized PTO, heavy implements required their own cumbersome gasoline engines, or relied on the unpredictable traction of heavy iron wheels rolling across loose dirt to drive their internal gears. The PTO turned the tractor into a mobile power plant. Equally transformative for the American market was the introduction of IH's Lift-All system. This was an early, highly successful implementation of hydraulics, a system that uses pressurized oil to lift, lower, and control heavy steel implements with minimal human effort. Prior to reliable hydraulics, a farmer cultivating 40 acres of soybeans had to manually heave a massive steel lever using raw shoulder and back strength to raise the cultivator blades out of the dirt at the end of every single row. With the lift-all system, a farmer simply pulled a small steel rod on the steering column. Pressurized oil did the bleeding. The physical exhaustion of the American harvest was permanently reduced. This level of engineering usually belonged to elite, prohibitively expensive machinery. But Farmall Works was an engine of mass production, designed to drive costs into the ground. In 1939, a brand new Farmall H carried a base price of roughly $750, approximately $16,500 in today's currency. For a Midwestern family farm still recovering from the financial scars of the Great Depression, this was a highly calculated investment. It cost less than the combined expense of feeding a team of draft horses and hiring extra harvest labor for a year. For many mid-sized operations, the purchase of a Farmall H could equal the profit margin of an entire autumn harvest, but the machine guaranteed a return on investment through sheer, unrelenting uptime. International Harvester's absolute moat in the American market was its closed industrial ecosystem. When a farmer bought a Farmall, they were not just buying a tractor, they were locking themselves into a proprietary universe. Plows, planters, and cultivators were specifically designed to mount seamlessly onto the Farmall chassis. If a domestic competitor built a slightly cheaper tractor, it did not matter, because the competitor's tractor could not accept the expensive IH implements the farmer already owned in his barn. The professional agricultural ecosystem of the United States quickly recognized and codified this supremacy. In 1939, the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory at the University of Nebraska, the ultimate independent testing authority that turned manufacturer horsepower claims into published, undeniable numbers, put the Farmall H and M through brutal drawbar and belt tests. The tractors passed with impeccable fuel economy and sustained power metrics. These numbers were immediately broadcast across the country by successful farming and farm journal magazines. Agricultural extension agents from the University of Illinois and Iowa State College utilized these exact metrics to advise local farmers on the economics of mechanization. The American Society of Agricultural Engineers adopted hardware standards heavily influenced by IH's PTO dimensions. Local farm bureaus from Ohio to the Dakotas saw the red machines become the default standard for agricultural credit. A loan officer at a rural bank rarely hesitated to finance a Farmall because the machine held its resale value, and the local dealer network guaranteed it would not sit broken during the critical weeks of spring. The local International Harvester dealer was an institution. Dealerships in places like Decatur, Illinois, or Waterloo, Iowa, were not just retail storefronts. They were fully stocked parts depots and mechanical triage centers. If a Farmall snapped a fan belt or blew a hydraulic seal on a Tuesday afternoon, the local IH dealer had the exact replacement part sitting on a wooden shelf, and a mechanic trained to install it. The dealer network, the mechanic, and the farmer all depended on the same parts shelf. By the time the production run of the letter series ended in the early 1950s, the output from Rock Island had defied standard industrial logic. Farmall Works had manufactured nearly 400,000 Farmall H tractors and over 270,000 Farmall M tractors. More than 500,000 nearly identical red machines were actively turning the American soil. The name stamped onto the cast iron radiator was not just a brand. It was a guarantee of survival. By the early 1970s, Farmall Works was no longer just a factory. It was a sovereign industrial state operating on the banks of the Mississippi River. The physical footprint of the Rock Island facility had expanded to over 2 million square feet of covered manufacturing space. Inside, more than 5,000 union workers operated in 3 relentless, continuous shifts. The blast furnaces roared around the clock, smelting raw iron ore into the heavy cast iron blocks that formed the chassis of the American farm. Every 24 hours, a continuous stream of rail cars rolled into the receiving yards, carrying hundreds of tons of raw materials. Every 24 hours, dozens of flatbed trucks rolled out, carrying freshly painted tractors secured by heavy chains. The factory had its own fire department, its own medical clinic, and its own internal rail system. The men and women who worked the assembly lines were often second- and third-generation employees. To hold a union card at Farmall Works was to hold a secure ticket to the American middle class. This immense industrial output was channeled through an ironclad American distribution architecture. International Harvester maintained a network of roughly 5,000 independent dealerships. They were anchored in county seats and rural crossroads, from the dairy farms of Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, to the vast irrigated fields of the San Joaquin Valley in California. A farmer in central Iowa rarely had to drive more than 20 miles to find a red building with the iconic black IH pylon, standing high above the gravel lot. These dealers were not just salesmen. They were the mechanical lifeblood of the county. The dealer network, the regional parts depots, and the Rock Island factory operated as a single, uninterrupted conveyor belt of agricultural power. When a farmer walked onto one of these IH dealership lots in 1973, the sheer scale of the equipment served as physical evidence of the brand's dominance. The tractors sat in perfectly aligned rows, the IH red paint gleaming against the dust of the rural highway. The smell of fresh diesel, heavy grease, and new rubber permeated the air. To climb into the custom-built cab of a new tractor, an enclosed operator station that protected the farmer from toxic dirt, deafening engine noise, and blistering summer heat, was to step into the future of American farming. The machinery moving down the Rock Island conveyor belt had evolved dramatically from the lightweight letter series of the 1940s. As American farms consolidated and grew larger, the implements they pulled grew wider and heavier. The soil required more drawbar pull, the sheer pulling force a tractor can deliver to an implement dragging through the earth. In response, die Merselligkeit, Farmall Works built increasingly massive machines to meet the escalating demands of the American horsepower race. In the 1960s, they introduced the 06 series, followed rapidly by the 56 series, pushing diesel output past 70, 80, and eventually 100 horsepower. But the absolute zenith of Farmall's mechanical empire arrived in 1971 with the introduction of the 66 series, specifically the International Harvester 1066. This was not a tractor for a part-time operation. It was a 120 horsepower, turbocharged diesel Leviathan built exclusively for heavy row crop tillage across massive acreage. When it debuted at the Farm Progress Show in autumn, field demonstrations drew crowds of thousands. The American farm economy of the 1970s was booming. Massive Soviet grain purchases had driven commodity prices to record highs, and the federal government was actively encouraging farmers to plant fence row to fence row. In this high-stakes environment of maximum production, the International Harvester 1066 became the weapon of choice. On a cold, wet morning in the Dakota Plains, where a massive disc harrow had to be pulled through heavy, clay-rich soil before the ground completely froze, the sheer torque of the 1066 meant the difference between preparing a 200-acre field for the spring and losing the planting window entirely. The machine's reliability was fiercely verified by the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, which recorded the 1066 as one of the most powerful and fuel-efficient two-wheel drive tractors ever tested up to that date. Local farm bureaus recommended it. Agricultural lenders eagerly financed it, knowing a 66 series tractor held its resale value better than almost any domestic competitor. This mechanical supremacy bred a culture of absolute generational loyalty. By the mid-1970s, International Harvester was not just selling farm equipment. They were selling an inherited American identity. The brand loyalty was fierce and tribal. If a grandfather had survived the Great Depression driving a Farmall Regular, and a father had expanded the acreage driving a Farmall M, the son was expected to finance a new 1066. The red IH logo was stitched onto feed caps, painted on rural mailboxes, and bolted to the front of barns across the Midwest. The peak of this cultural and industrial power was immortalized in 1974. That year, the assembly lines at Farmall Works achieved a staggering manufacturing milestone. They built the 5 millionth International Harvester tractor. The machine, a 1066 turbo, was painted a custom metallic silver to mark the occasion, but its engineering bloodline was pure red. When it was paraded before the press and farm executives, it represented the absolute zenith of American agricultural dominance. No other tractor manufacturer on Earth had built 5 million machines. The financial metrics of the era reflected this colossal scale. By 1977, International Harvester's agricultural equipment division was generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. To maintain this momentum, Farmall Works operated at a blistering pace. The factory floor in Rock Island spanned roughly 44 acres under a single, continuous roof. Over 5,000 members of the United Auto Workers, or UAW, manned the welding stations, the engine hoists, and the paint booths. In a regional economy anchored by heavy industry, that specific payroll was not just a corporate expense. It was the absolute economic foundation of the Quad Cities area, supporting thousands of mortgages, local businesses, and regional banks. In 1976, International Harvester sought to widen its moat further by launching the 86 series, featuring the revolutionary Control Center. This was a fully enclosed, ergonomically designed operator cab that was mounted on rubber isolators to separate it from the tractor's massive transmission housing. It physically decoupled the farmer from the brutal vibration, deafening noise, and toxic dust of the field. Inside the cab, the operator had air conditioning, a clean air filtration system, and an AM/FM radio. Under the bright halogen lights of the National Farm Machinery Show in Louisville, Kentucky, the 86 series looked like the undisputed future of farming. A prospective buyer, climbing the steel steps into the control center of a new 1486, was insulated from the outside world. He sat inside a 145 horsepower, climate-controlled command bunker. The American agricultural economy was operating on maximum leverage, and the tractors were the collateral that made it possible. On a massive, highly indebted operation in the Red River Valley, A catastrophic equipment failure during the narrow 2-week autumn harvest did not just mean a delayed schedule. It meant a failure to deliver grain, a missed bank payment, and the potential foreclosure of a family operation. The farmer paid a premium for an IH tractor because the local dealer in Grand Island, Nebraska, the regional parts depot in Memphis, Tennessee, and the sprawling factory in Rock Island, Illinois, implicitly guaranteed that the machine would not stop running. To keep the assembly lines moving at this unprecedented volume, International Harvester Management made critical operational compromises. They signed highly generous, multi-year labor contracts with the UAW to prevent work stoppages. They borrowed heavily to finance corporate expansion and maintain a massive, slow-moving inventory of parts. They built a corporate structure that required massive, uninterrupted cash flow just to service its own existence. As the 1970s drew to a close, Farmall Works was a fortress of American engineering. The blast furnaces burned hot. The assembly lines rolled flawlessly. The dealer network was fully stocked. But the entire empire was perfectly calibrated for an agricultural boom that was already beginning to fracture. The collapse of Farmall Works and the broader international harvester empire was not caused by a sudden failure in mechanical engineering. The tractors rolling out of Rock Island in the late 1970s were as powerful and reliable as anything in the field. Instead, the Red Empire was destroyed by a brutal, overlapping collision of systemic pressures. The unraveling of this American industrial giant was driven primarily by Force 5, scale, and labor costs, followed immediately by the devastating impact of Force 2, farm credit, and political headwinds. The American turning point arrived not in a cornfield, but in a corporate boardroom. By 1977, International Harvester was generating billions in revenue, but its profit margins were dangerously thin compared to its primary domestic rival, John Deere. Harvester was carrying a massive burden of corporate debt, and its executive leadership was determined to slash manufacturing costs. To achieve this, the company brought in a new CEO, Archie McCardell, who was mandated to increase efficiency and extract concessions from the United Auto Workers. The specific target was the existing union contract at manufacturing facilities like Farmall Works. The company demanded new rules regarding mandatory overtime and the restructuring of seniority rights. The UAW adamantly refused. On November 1, 1979, the United Auto Workers officially went on strike. At Farmall Works in Rock Island, over 5,000 union workers walked off the assembly lines. The towering blast furnaces were banked. The internal rail cars stopped moving. The massive 44-acre facility went completely dark. International Harvester Management believed they had enough finished inventory sitting on dealership lots to weather a short work stoppage. They fundamentally miscalculated the resolve of the union and the timing of the agricultural calendar. The strike lasted for 172 days. It stretched through the winter of 1979 and deep into the spring of 1980. In the American agricultural equipment industry, spring is the most critical commercial window of the year. It is when farmers require new equipment for planting, and more importantly, when they require an uninterrupted supply of replacement parts for the machines already in the field. The true damage of the 1979 strike was not merely the loss of unbuilt tractors inside Farmall Works. The catastrophe occurred at the retail level. Across the Midwest, International Harvester dealerships simply ran out of inventory. A farmer in central Illinois operating an IH-1066 who blew a hydraulic pump during spring tillage could not wait weeks for a corporate labor dispute to end. The soil had to be turned. The seed had to be planted. When the local IH dealer could not supply the necessary part, that farmer was forced to look across the street. This was the moment of competitive displacement. John Deere, headquartered just up the Mississippi River in Moline, Illinois, was not on strike. Their factories were running at full capacity. Their parts depots were fully stocked. Dealerships selling green tractors gladly accepted red machines as trade-ins, capturing multi-generational international harvester families who simply needed working equipment. The absolute loyalty that Farmall Works had spent 50 years cultivating was severed by an empty parts shelf. When the UAW strike finally concluded in April 1980, the financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. The work stoppage had drained International Harvester of roughly $600 million in period dollars, approximately $2.2 billion today. To keep the corporate entity solvent, Harvester was forced to borrow massive sums of money at exactly the wrong time in American economic history. As the lights flickered back on at Farmall Works and the assembly line slowly began to move again, the entire landscape of American agriculture collapsed. In 1980, the federal government enacted a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, instantly erasing a massive export market and sending commodity prices plummeting. Simultaneously, the United States Federal Reserve, battling rampant national inflation, aggressively raised interest rates. By 1981, the prime interest rate exceeded 20%. This triggered the farm debt crisis, the most severe rural economic depression since the 1930s. The entire American farm economy was built on credit. Farmers borrowed money to buy seed, land, and machinery. At 20% interest, financing a new $60,000 International Harvester tractor became financial suicide. A machine that was affordable 2 years prior suddenly cost double over the life of a loan. Furthermore, as land values plummeted, the equity that farmers traditionally used to secure those equipment loans simply evaporated. The American farmer stopped buying. They parked their aging tractors in the shed and learned to repair them. Dealerships that had clamored for inventory during the strike were now choking on a surplus of unsold 86 series and newly introduced 88 series tractors. Farmall Works was producing massive, state-of-the-art machines for a market that had fundamentally ceased to exist. The debt incurred during the strike, combined with the collapse of retail revenue, trapped International Harvester in a fatal financial vice. The company was bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and the interest payments on their corporate loans were cannibalizing the remaining cash reserves. In a desperate bid to stimulate retail sales and reclaim their lost market share, International Harvester authorized the engineers at Farmall Works to release a final, highly advanced line of row crop tractors. Introduced in 1981, the 50 series, led by the flagship 5488, was a mechanical masterpiece. It featured an innovative forward airflow cooling system to keep dust away from the operator, and a revolutionary 18-speed synchronized transmission that eliminated the clunky physical gear shifting of the previous decade. Under normal economic conditions, the 5488 would have dominated the American harvest. But the American market of the early 1980s was not functioning on mechanical merit. It was functioning on strict financial survival. It did not matter how smoothly a new transmission shifted if the farmer could not secure a loan to purchase it. The 50 series tractors rolled off the Rock Island assembly line and went straight into a commercial void. They sat on dealership lots across the Midwest, their bright red paint slowly fading under the summer sun, gathering dust as the agricultural depression deepened. The structural collapse accelerated at the local level. The sprawling network of independent International Harvester dealers, the very foundation of the brand's absolute American dominance, began to disintegrate. Dealerships that had anchored rural county seats for 3 generations were suddenly forced into bankruptcy. When a local IH dealer in a town like Fort Dodge, Iowa, or Hastings, Nebraska, locked its doors, the damage was permanent. The trained mechanics were laid off. The specialized tools were auctioned. The massive inventory of replacement parts was liquidated. As these red outposts vanished from the rural highway, the remaining farmers who still operated Farmall equipment were left geographically stranded. If a farmer's 1066 broke down in the middle of the spring planting season, they could no longer drive 10 miles to get a replacement hydraulic valve. They had to drive 50 miles, or wait days for a part to be shipped. In the unforgiving arithmetic of American agriculture, excessive downtime is a fatal metric. Forced by the sheer necessity of local parts and local service, even the most deeply loyal international harvester families began trading their red machines for John Deere green. The corporate moat had completely evaporated. By 1984, the corporate entity of International Harvester was suffocating under roughly $3 billion in debt. The Agricultural Equipment Division, which had built the company into a global empire, was now bleeding the parent corporation dry. The executive board faced a mathematical reality that would have been completely unthinkable just 5 years earlier. To save the commercial truck and engine divisions of the company, the agricultural heritage had to be amputated. On November 26, 1984, International Harvester officially surrendered. The company agreed to sell its entire agricultural equipment division to Tenneco Incorporated, a massive conglomerate that already owned the rival J.I. Case Tractor Company. The purchase price was approximately $430 million in period dollars. In a single boardroom transaction, the undisputed king of the American row crop market was absorbed by a former competitor. The immediate consequence of the Tenneco buyout was industrial consolidation. The new corporate entity, renamed Case 1H, did not need two massive tractor manufacturing networks. Tenneco already possessed a sprawling, highly efficient tractor assembly plant in Racine, Wisconsin. Farmall Works in Rock Island, with its immense 44-acre footprint, its aging blast furnaces, and its history of bitter labor disputes, was completely redundant. The decision was purely financial. The fortress had to be closed. The announcement was made. The timeline was set. The dismantling of the greatest tractor factory on Earth was not sudden. It was a slow, agonizing wind down. Through the harsh winter of 1984 and into the early spring of 1985, the workforce at Rock Island methodically assembled the final batches of 50 series tractors. The massive stockpiles of raw steel were consumed. The component bins were emptied. The internal rail cars carried their final loads of cast iron engine blocks. As the weather warmed in the Mississippi River Valley, the rhythm of the factory floor fundamentally changed. The deafening roar of continuous production faded. Entire sections of the assembly line were powered down and plunged into darkness. The workforce shrank from thousands to hundreds, and finally, to dozens. The sprawling parking lots outside the factory gates sat empty. The end arrived in May. It was not a corporate transition. It was an industrial funeral. The last tractor moved down the line. The paint booth shut off. The overhead cranes stopped. The final engine was started. The tires touched the floor. The machine drove out. The workers went home. The blast furnaces went cold. The steel doors locked. The factory went silent. The Red Empire was gone. The corporate entity survived the transaction, but its industrial soul was fundamentally altered. In 1985, Tenneco officially merged the remnants of International Harvester's agricultural equipment division with J.I. Case, creating a massive new corporate brand, Case IH. The new tractors rolling off the assembly lines in Wisconsin retained a variation of the famous red paint, and the sprawling network of dealers that had managed to survive the farm debt crisis was reorganized, consolidated, and rebranded. However, the Farmall name, the specific title that had successfully mechanized the American harvest, was unceremoniously retired, deemed a relic of a failed corporate structure. It would be decades before the conglomerate revived the name as a marketing decal for a line of compact utility tractors. The true legacy of International Harvester in America was not carried forward by corporate executives in a boardroom. It was preserved by the people who actually drove the machines. Today, there is a massive, fiercely dedicated American preservation community that treats the products of Rock Island not as obsolete machinery, but as essential industrial artifacts. Organizations like the National Red Power Club hold massive annual roundups across the Midwest, drawing tens of thousands of collectors, retired dealership mechanics, and multi-generational farming families. Across the rural landscape, estate auctions in places like Iowa, Nebraska, and Ohio still center entirely around the red tractors. Collectors and working farmers will fiercely bid against one another for a well-maintained letter series, an '06 or a '66 series machine. They will scour swap meets for original wide front axles, specific cast iron engine blocks, and authentic IH fast hitch components. In many cases, a pristine International Harvester, 1066 sold today at a county auction, will command a higher purchase price in pure dollars than it did when it sat brand new on a dealership lot in 1974. They do not pay these premiums purely out of Midwestern nostalgia. They pay them because the original machines still possess immense, undeniable functional value in the modern agricultural economy. A small or mid-sized family farm does not always need a massive $500,000 GPS-guided modern tractor to perform daily operations. An International Harvester 1486 with a functioning power takeoff and simple mechanical hydraulics can still rake hay, run a heavy grain auger, pull a gravity wagon, or clear winter snow from a dairy feedlot. It matters because the machine was fundamentally built to be repaired by the operator. It can be kept running with a standard set of heavy wrenches, a shop manual, and basic mechanical intuition. It runs without microchips, without proprietary software diagnostics, without emissions fluid sensors, and without a crippling six-figure equipment loan. It represents a level of mechanical independence that American farmers once took for granted, and which modern equipment manufacturers have largely engineered out of existence. The physical fortress that built that independence, however, is completely gone. If you drive to Rock Island, Illinois today and navigate to the banks of the Mississippi River, you will not find the beating heart of the American harvest. The colossal 44-acre facility that once employed over 5,000 people was shuttered, stripped of its valuable machinery, left to decay, and eventually subjected to the wrecking ball in the 1990s. The massive blast furnaces were dismantled. The continuous assembly lines were sold off for scrap metal. The internal rail yards were entirely paved over. What stands at the physical address of Farmall Works today is a quiet, generic landscape of light industrial parks, commercial warehousing, and empty, weed-choked concrete pads. The physical empire was entirely erased from the map. But there is a surprise footnote to this industrial collapse, one that quietly dictates the daily rhythm of the modern harvest. While the Rock Island factory was demolished and the corporate entity was absorbed, the engineering standards pioneered by International Harvester became immortal. The specific physical dimensions of the mechanical power takeoff shaft, the precise geometric spacing of adjustable row crop tires, and the fundamental architecture of the implements that attach to the back of a tractor were deeply influenced, and in some cases entirely standardized, by the engineers working at Farmall Works in the 1930s and 1940s. Today, when a modern $500,000 green John Deere tractor backs up to a newly manufactured implement in a field in South Dakota, the physical connection between those two machines is often conforming to a mechanical standard forced upon the industry by a red tractor nearly 80 years ago. The brand died, but its geometry conquered the industry. The story of Farmall Works reveals a profound truth about American commercial culture, demonstrating how the United States scales, exhausts, and ultimately discards industrial excellence. It highlights the devastating gap between what an agricultural system says it values: durability, craftsmanship, and local dealer loyalty, and what it is ultimately forced to obey: the unforgiving mathematics of credit cycles, labor costs, and corporate debt. When a farm culture built on mechanical repair and generational permanence is replaced by high-interest financing and absolute corporate scale, the machines may become more efficient, but a fundamental rural resilience is permanently lost. But somewhere in a freshly cut alfalfa field in rural Indiana, as the late summer sun drops below the tree line, a 40-year-old International Harvester 1066 is still in gear, its turbocharged diesel engine still roaring over the sound of the wind, still wearing the faded red paint of a vanished empire, and still turning the American soil. See you in the next one.